And we're live. Hello, guys.
Finally.
Hello.
Hello there.
There are a bunch of comments in the stream already. We have
Really?
Yeah, people commenting, and
Can you bring them up? Show them
sure.
One by one.
Yeah. So we have Tristan saying awesome.
That's a very good one. That's a good one.
Yeah, we have Exio saying hello there. Hello there. Good to see you. Then we have first question. Does anyone know if LynxJS supports Google AdMob or any monetization medium? And then we have a response for that from Otamosho Israel saying hello all. And then, are you serious? We just got lunch yesterday and don't even have a Discord channel.
See, so I guess first things first. Looks like it.
Yeah. Like first you have to ship, and then you can build ecosystem and community.
Exactly.
Yeah, but with AdMob you can't really earn any money easily. So there's
unless you are releasing your app in China where you don't really care about it.
Good point.
Then I guess it's a different story.
Unless you are ByteDance and you release your app immediately to like 2 billion users.
Yeah.
And you already have a good monetization strategy.
Have you guys had a chance to play around with it?
My promise is to come to this StreamYards stream lives unprepared, so I didn't. But I have it. I have my console set up. I have the documentation open, so we can play around with it.
All right. Yeah, I just went through the documentation, wrote down some things that are interesting to me personally, and maybe some things I do not like or I'm a little bit suspicious about.
First hater.
But we'll get there. You know how it is with me. I always have my my pessimistic view on pretty much everything, right?
Mike, what do you want to talk about? What's your approach to doing this live stream about Lynx?
I don't know. We can pull up the documentation or the website and just go through it all together. Yeah. I also have some notes and the things that I'm excited about and the things I'm mostly excited about the things in general. So maybe when Matt joins later, we will be able to talk a bit more about it from the perspective of
architectural decisions and
stuff.
What's
yeah.
under the
I mean,
hood.
I guess it is generally interesting that we see so much great infrastructure open source by ByteDance. And I would also say it is very interesting that they take such an approach that they build ecosystem, right? It's as if you know, on one hand, you would assume they could have used existing libraries such as React Native, and then on the other hand, you have the release, and apparently there are reasons why they decided to go that route. So this is, I think, what is probably the most exciting to look at. Also, when you take into account how many things they released out of the box that we're struggling with for like 8 years now.
Yeah, I guess like that's such a good take, because like they could have just contribute to React Native itself and use React Native itself, but probably like it was limiting for them in some ways, because the React Lynx is only the first like framework that works with Lynx. They already shipped a bunch of things that are not React based. So probably they have a bunch of different teams working on different frameworks, and React Native is just not that easy to, I guess, work with if you want to use like, I don't know, Vue or something, or Angular.
It's impossible at this point, if I'm not mistaken. You have to use React. With Lynx at this point, I guess we will start to see Lynx Vue, Lynx Solid, Lynx whatever in upcoming months or weeks, or maybe it's there on some GitHub repository. Who knows?
Yeah, they said it here. They said it at the end of this, democratizing. So they are open sourcing React Lynx. It's an initial front-end flavor framework. However, Lynx isn't limited to React. Other frameworks already represent roughly half of Lynx overall usage. So yeah, they like Mike said, they really released not just one toy to play around with and build up. They released like a bunch of different things, like the whole system, the whole architecture, to build upon in the future.
I think it's mostly because of their approach. Like with React Native, you create components, and those components are really building blocks. With Lynx, you have those primitive components that resemble those components present in web browsers. So Vue technically can render them out of the box because they don't differ from those from web browsers. So it's really easy now to implement some kind of, let's say, UI library over Lynx. I would say, this is my personal opinion based on what I read. It's basically like just taking the renderer part from already existing library and putting those views, texts instead of divs, spans, and so on. Those primitive building blocks from web.
Yeah, like I guess we can just fire up a new project in it and then like try to write something with cursor or something, and then maybe we can just use vanilla JavaScript.
That would be a good idea. I think then once we do this, we can talk a bit more about the internals. I was mostly looking at the prim.js side lately because we're working on Node API integration for React Native. So when I realized they do have Node API out of the box, I started doing some research to better understand it, and there is still some interesting gotchas around the engines themselves. So I would say, let's try to get this up and running. Actually, this will be great, so everybody can see how hard is it or easy, and then we can potentially talk about the details.
What's the biome? Okay, biome is like an ESLint.
How can you don't know this? You should know this project, and you should know everything around it, including all the drama and founders.
We can schedule some live stream.
That deserves a separate live stream.
Yeah. Should I use biome or should I just use ESLint?
Or nothing.
I'm gonna use biome.
Have you noticed there was no option to skip it?
There was. That's
was
what
it?
Łukasz
was that?
did. That's what Łukasz did.
I didn't. I selected biome.
None.
Oh.
You should use space to select.
Okay, let's do it again.
Interesting. No. Because I didn't see it. I didn't see such option.
Okay, I'm doing it again.
Go.
So I'm choosing TypeScript. And
now use space.
Oh, I use space to select.
Mm-hmm.
So I can select all of them. Nice. Okay. So we're going to Lynx and then git init. Okay. I guess. And then npm install. So I'm gonna go there.
So while you're working on it, we can talk a little bit about the JavaScript engine itself, because it's not really an engine. It's abstraction layer over engines.
But exactly.
You know better.
No, actually, I'm happy you say this, because when I found out about this release, I was on a meeting and I got super excited. So I pulled up Cloud Code in my terminal and I started chatting with it about the project. And what I quickly realized was that even though it is called a engine, it is not. And so in that sense, I got real confused about it. And I was like, am I reading this wrong, or like what's going on here? And you're right, it's more of an abstraction. And you have actual engines under the hood, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Have you checked how deep did you go?
I know there are 3 of them. V8 is set by default on Android, or I'm mistaken. Okay, maybe QuickJS is default on Android, but on iOS, on the other hand,
No, it's JSC, right?
JSC is on
It's
iOS.
JSC on both of them.
No, so
Crap.
I did. I did read about it, and even though Matt is not with us, he also left some notes ahead of the live stream, and so it actually uses different engines for different threads.
Oh,
So yeah, and we can talk about it later, and why that makes sense or not. But on iOS, it uses JSC on one thread, obviously, and then it uses prim.js on Android on both threads. So it is not using JSC on Android, which is interesting. I mean, this is pretty confusing situation with the engines, which is interesting, especially the different threads and different engines situation.
yeah, I'm very curious to get to know why exactly why. What's the reason for that? I mean,
Yeah,
technically,
I see Matt is now editing the Google document that I'm texting him. Maybe I write here, hey Matt, it's Mike, we're waiting for you. Check Discord. This is like talking with somebody back in the early days. But yeah, we'll talk about the engine situation later. What is important right now is that prim.js is more of an abstraction. And what's interesting is that it doesn't use inside prim.js. You don't have like you normally have this bridging layer between the abstraction and the engine, and that is what inside React Native specifically is the JSI, which is JavaScript interface. And prim.js is interesting in a sense that it uses Node API to run those engines. So it has a very comprehensive Node API support. Now, I haven't played around with it yet to tell whether this is how big is this, but theoretically, and I guess this is easily doable, you can run any Node module now inside the Lynx application because that's how those engines are being executed anyway. So this is somewhat great news. And Oscar told me this, but this is probably in Lynx repository, not inside prim.js, is that there is also a JSI implementation as well. And I see we have Matt in the lobby, which is
Nice.
a good indication of my ping working. I think did you see my message, Matt, in the Google Doc?
No.
Okay, because we were just talking about prim.js, and I open up your notes, and then
Okay.
I see you being literally on the line where I'm focused at as well, and I say, okay, I'm just gonna write there, hey Matt, we are waiting for you on a live stream. Please come by, and you just appeared. So
I just appeared. It was a coincidence.
Yeah,
I got here as
exactly.
fast as I could.
That's all right. We're just talking about different engines and different threads and engines. You did leave some notes, so maybe you can give us some more light into this, because I know there is different engines apparently being used on different threads, which seems like not that usual situation when we take React Native into account.
Yeah, it's interesting. For iOS only, prim.js uses their kind of custom JS engine for that primary thread, and then they use JavaScript core for the secondary thread. And that's interesting. And on Android, they say for efficiency or something. It's there in their documentation. They say that on Android it uses prim.js for both of them, and I don't understand.
Is it because JSC
Okay,
is...
it's great somebody said this, because I wasn't sure if there is something fundamentally wrong with me, or and That's good. That's very yeah, it's good to hear that.
It makes me think I must be missing something.
Guys, do you remember how in early days of React Native, you'd have to like include new versions of JSC in the Android Gradle files? Because like the one in React Native was like old, and then on iOS you didn't have to do that because I guess JSC is a part of iOS itself.
Yes.
That's true.
Exactly.
Yeah, every
Yeah.
Apple operating system. Yeah.
That may be why, right?
I mean, yes, but they don't do that with Hermes, obviously. And so the kind of runtime efficiency thing that I think about is, and this is not just a JavaScript thing. If we were talking about any other sort of bytecode interpreter or any other text-based interpreter for that matter, whether we're talking about Lua or JavaScript or Python or Ruby or what have you, whether it's a data center workload or it's a mobile phone workload, I'm always thinking about what is the sort of power efficiency of that. And here, that kind of comes up for me as a big exclamation point question mark with two engines is ideally for these scripting runtimes, you want the sort of hot loop of the main interpreter to fit inside the L1 cache, the level 1 cache of the CPU, so that that never gets evicted. It's always there, fetching the next opcode from memory and kind of proceeding on that way. There are some interpreters that even do some very interesting sort of packed representation of opcodes so that they kind of load the next several of them into a 256-bit or 512-bit sort of register within the CPU so that they don't have to do a bunch of fetches all in a row. And so keeping that sort of core, that hot path of the interpreter loop, or if it's a JIT or whatever, that hot path sort of keeping that in the L1 cache is pretty important for making sure that you aren't losing too much efficiency from using a scripting language versus a precompiled language. And so when you have one JavaScript runtime across two threads, that instruction cache on the one CPU core gets reused, right? Because the code, the executable code is the same. The context, the registers, the stack might be different between those two threads, but the instructions that make up the hot loop of that sort of main interpreter switch statement or jump table, if you will, stay hot. They don't get paged out. They don't get evicted from the cache. When you have two different JavaScript runtimes, it seems improbable to me that they're both staying in the L1 cache of a given core. Now, level 1 cache is per physical CPU core. They're not shared across CPU cores. So it's possible that you could do a thing called sort of pinning like the CPU or the core affinity of one of those threads to one core and the other thread to a different core. And then for the two different JavaScript runtimes. And then the JavaScript runtime on the second core doesn't evict it in its L1 hot path, or its L1 cache sort of interpreter hot path, doesn't evict the L1 cache on the other core that's running the prim.js runtime. Okay, that could sort of make some kind of sense, but you're still using up the L1 cache space on some other core to do that. And there's something that I'm missing, because there'd have to be a really amazing responsiveness, some user visible throughput advantage to that, to make that not be a not waste, but like the sort of steady state memory usage, just talking about RAM at this point, of one JavaScript runtime versus 2 JavaScript runtimes, now you've just increased the memory usage by, let's lowball it and say, a megabyte, maybe 2 megabytes. And that's the difference between caching more data, having Apollo GraphQL caches that are fully hydrated more of the time, higher resolution images, like all kinds of stuff. And if you have to have both of those running at the same time, and you've got like a lock screen widget, like a live widget, where the memory usage is even more constrained, or you're on watchOS where the memory usage is even more constrained. 2 megabytes doesn't sound like a big deal, but it's one of those things where it kind of starts to add up. And so I get the architectural having 2 threads. That's, I think, pretty genius. It's an interesting approach at the very least that they've obviously made work at scale. But this thing where Android gets the efficient thing and iOS gets the seemingly not efficient thing, I can't kind of wrap my head around. I keep kind of bumping into these, what I would consider to be sort of performance truisms.
Can you bottom line what's the difference between Android and iOS? Can you say again?
So according to their documentation on Android, both that main thread and that secondary thread are both running using their QuickJS based runtime. On iOS, one thread is using that QuickJS based runtime, and the other one is using JavaScript core. So they're running kind of 2 JavaScript runtimes at once.
Yeah.
And normally, with every platform holder, not just Apple, but with platform holders, if you're going to introduce like a JIT compiled language or runtime on their platform, you need to go through extra special sort of gates to do that, because it's a potential security attack surface. Here, that's not the case, and they are obviously already running prim.js on one of the threads. So I don't quite get why they don't run it on both of the threads. Maybe there's some operating system level integration with JavaScript core where it's advantageous in some way. There's seemingly missing information that I didn't get out of the documentation when I was reading it.
I know it's forbidden on iOS to implement a custom web browser not using JSC. So maybe that's somehow related.
Well, in this case specifically, I was actually thinking about it, and my understanding, and we'll get to it later. Once we discuss the engine situation, we can talk about what is actually being the default and what is not, because from my research, I'm not so sure what are the default engine options and what are the conditions for them being turned on and off. But keeping that aside, prim.js is an extended or improved version of QuickJS, which itself is sort of a bare bone or simple C JS engine implementation. And my understanding, and Matt, you'll have way more detailed insights into it, is that QuickJS is on its own an interpreted engine, so it's not an AOT engine. So theoretically, it is not in line with what I've been thinking to this day was the Apple guideline that you cannot really ship a JIT compiler. On the other hand, from what I'm understanding, is that QuickJS is not when I was reading the terms and conditions and doing some research before this live stream, it turns out that the JIT sort of Apple guideline limitation are more about executable machine code during the runtime rather than the engine. And there are things related to sort of memory allocations as well, and that native code being executed at a runtime rather than the JavaScript engine itself being interpreted an engine. So that is why QuickJS might be potentially okay with that. I mean, must be okay, otherwise they wouldn't ship it to the App Store. I'm curious, what is your thinking in that sense? In that sense?
Me?
I was also confused for a second there.
Burak has a note here. JavaScript core comes with the device, so saving on app size might be a reason. That would be true if they didn't have prim.js running on one thread and therefore having to package it and having JSC run on the other. If it was JSC for both threads, then I get it. That's why this is so confusing. Yeah, so typically with platform holders, whether I'm going to get low level here for a second. So basically what the platform holders don't want for security exposure reasons is they don't want your app to be able to arbitrarily sort of create code and executable memory pages based on user-generated content. So this manifests in a couple of ways. One is that typically no JITs are allowed. Yes, there are examples where very, very large companies have brokered a deal with, say, Apple or Google or whatever. Google cares. I don't say that they don't care. They care less. But as an example, when Apple last year finally lifted this veil and let emulators be shipped on the App Store, all of those emulators are not using JITs. So if you are playing like a PSP emulator or a Super Nintendo emulator or something else, a Nintendo 3DS emulator, it's running in interpreted mode. And that's why you go, why can't this iPad Pro run a Nintendo DS emulator quickly enough? It's because all of them have their JITs turned off. As a result, then you have to kind of interpret opcode by opcode, and there's different ways to massage it to make it faster, but it all kind of boils down to the same thing. Similarly, there are aspects of CSS in modern browsers that compile to GPU compute shaders. And so that's another way that you can get sort of low-level code running on the device that comes from user-generated content. Same thing with certain kinds of WebGPU shader language shaders and things like this. WebGPU's taken a long time to come out on consumer devices, mobile devices, because of how much fuzzing and security testing sort of needs to happen. Because in the worst case, there's a malicious threat actor that gets low-level WGSL code that causes like an overflow, like deep, or causes a security problem deep in the GPU, which has complete unfettered access to memory. And then that's problematic, right? We've so far avoided phones getting like crazy BIOS and firmware viruses the same way that PCs historically did for a long time, both Macs and Windows machines and DOS machines. So that's why they're so nervous about JITs. But prim.js and quick.js is not a JIT. It doesn't. AOT compile doesn't necessarily mean native. It can also mean that they've done bytecode level optimization. So going back to the React Native Windows days, Chakra Core, you could have it emit bytecode bundles and then use those across things. And at BlueJeans, we did. But when you looked at the bytecode, it would actually do an optimization pass on the bytecode itself, inlining trivial functions, doing a little bit of constant folding and things like this. So AOT compilation doesn't necessarily mean turning it into native code, although it often does. And that Chakra Core example is an example where making the bytecode compiler a little bit smarter, and by a little, I mean smarter like in the way that like 1990s C++ compilers were smart. It's not huge major optimizations. You can get the bytecode to be more optimal, and then that means that when you are interpreting, you are avoiding unnecessary call overhead and sort of stuff like that. But so JITs can be put onto kind of major mobile platforms. Usually requires some kind of, I'm going to say ad hoc, but I don't know for certain, some kind of negotiation with the platform holder where they do a deeper security vetting of your JIT runtime or of your CSS layout runtime or of your, in general, user-generated content that produces non-deterministic executable code on their platform. That's kind of what it sort of boils down to from the platform holder perspective. And it's all for very good security reasons. As a consumer, I can find it stymieing, but I can also know, like, no, this, if they weren't this strict about it, we would be like back in like the early 2000s in terms of Trojans and viruses and worms infecting everybody's machines. And I'd rather not have that come to pass again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hermes, the current default runtime for React Native, does bytecode optimizations, like you said. So this is an example of ahead of time compilation, but not compilation. Like it's still permitted to do such things and get accepted to App Store, for example.
Yeah, well, like you're doing a transform on the code, right?
Exactly.
To turn it from one form into another, like unoptimized to optimized. And so that requires sort of a knowledge of not just parsing and lexing, but like a semantic knowledge as well. And so, you know, like a formatter is not a compiler because it doesn't understand the semantics of your code, right? It just does it with lexing and parsing tokens. I think that's correct. Someone can fight me if they want to correct me on that. And so an example of this, for instance, is for Java jar files and .NET assemblies that contain bytecode. There were products commercial products that you could buy that would go through the bytecode and obfuscate it so that people couldn't easily decompile or reverse engineer your Java or your .NET application. There's people that thought like, oh, bytecode's too easy to decompile. Let's fuck it up some. But I think that it wasn't .fuscator. There's a really popular one for .NET, and it's actually, I think, built into Visual Studio now. But in the mid 2000s, it was very popular. And I was working for a social networking company at the time. This is 2005, I want to say. And they were using .NET and Mono, and they had a client. So they were obfuscating those binaries. One of the things that the obfuscator did was it would inline functions so that you'd get really large functions as a result. And it would increase your binary size by 10 or 20 kilobytes or something like that. But an interesting thing happened where when we would benchmark it, it would be faster. Because there was some optimizations that was ended up doing at the bytecode level that then helped the JIT do a slightly better job when it was translating it into native code. But you would still call that obfuscator sort of pass on the bytecode sort of an optimizing compiler because it has to understand the semantics of register pressure and what temporaries are safe to overwrite versus or not, and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of where my mental model of where that fuzzy line sort of is. But it's a loosely held opinion. I'm willing to be spanked by someone who actually has a computer science degree.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's not going to be me. Unless I try to beat you with a bit of AI.
Yeah.
However,
You did graduate, though. I remember you graduated.
Yes, I did, but I'm afraid our computer science is not is still below the threshold of what you would consider appropriate to call it that way in the
Definitely.
US.
I don't have a degree
However,
at all, so I'm totally inappropriate.
however, sort of we can go back to the engines in a bit, and we can talk about the differences between Prim.js and Quick.js. I think this is pretty interesting. However, I've been sort of trying to understand in the background as you were guys talking the threading situation, and I cannot say with full confidence what are the default options. However, I did find this, which is pretty interesting, which is the enum that lets you configure the default engine option, and based on the comment, it is JSC in both cases, which is the main thread and the background thread, with an option to configure it to Quick.js or actually V8, which I think was not possible beforehand, and looks like it's just left there for some compliance. And what is interesting though here is that we've been mostly talking about two threads so far, right? So the main thread one engine and the background thread another engine. Appears that there is, and that is really interesting, there seems to be so many interesting hidden innovations in Lynx. Another one that I was able to find is that it actually has 4 different engines, four different threads, which I believe is slightly more comprehensive than React Native. We have UI thread, the JavaScript thread, the template assembly thread, and layout thread. And so there is 4 threads, and there is 4 rendering strategies. There is strategy all on UI, which runs everything on the UI thread. There is most tasks on template assembly thread, part on layout, and multi-threads, which is pretty interesting. There is just 4 different threads and 4 different strategies. And so I started digging deeper to understand what is the template assembly thread's purpose, because that is in principle just more comprehensive. I believe we have in React Native, we don't really have that type of thread, I guess, unless we talk about all those queue threads. Actually, there might be anyway. Say of UI representation, so we can think of it as sort of building up the shadow tree, the rendering of the UI, management of components, cross-thread communication, and even handling. So it is interesting that there seems to be a separate thread for processing and assembling the UI structure, and there is, so like the shadow thread, there is another thread for calculating layout, so sort of the yoga thread from the React Native terminology, the platform thread, which is the UI thread, the actual UI thread, and the JavaScript thread. And then there are flags, and that is interesting to me, that there is flag that lets you choose where to render, on which thread you want to render, and then you can either explicitly set it or do it manually. And there is a flag that is called enable auto concurrency, which will basically pick the right thread based on some conditions. So it seems like even though they're not running latest React, they do have a very good fundamentals for implementing something that we would call Fabric, I guess, in React Native, as far as threading goes, and actually pretty comprehensive. Yeah, so that's defining basically. It's pretty interesting that there is something like that.
Yeah, on the background thread thing, they actually have changed the text since yesterday when I took my notes. So it used to say that on iOS we use JavaScript core for the background thread, and now it doesn't. So now it says we use JavaScript core by default unless you need to use prim.js for debugging. So that's an awesome clarification, and this makes a lot more sense to me now. If they're using JavaScript core for both threads, then you don't have that sort of cache eviction problem that I was.
Yeah, and that seems to be aligned with what the flag says. And I would say, I don't know, seems like I haven't done benchmarking, but I would say JSC on iOS is pretty good compared to Android. That's been always the case. That's why we used to ship a separate JSC build for Android to keep it up with features.
Yeah, we just did a big benchmarking project for a corporate sponsor, and I'm a big fan of Hermes, and at a job that I had, we had early access to the Hermes repo before it was made public, and I ported it to that platform that I was working on, and so I was very excited about it. So I'm couching Solid. I like Hermes, and I like its approach that it's taking. But we found in benchmarking that JavaScript, Hermes versus JavaScript core, Hermes was about 70% slower in the 3JS frustum culling hot path. And there were several cases where Hermes was faster than JavaScript core in ECS, like bit ECS, and a couple of other like benchmarks. But the one that really mattered is that main render loop in 3JS in terms of frame rate for mobile 3D apps running in 3JS JavaScript library. So JavaScript core sort of had to be used if you wanted to hit 60 FPS on a certain class of phone. And so there are definitely cases. I have fresh data from just a few months ago with latest Hermes, with latest React Native, with latest whatever, where JavaScript core is still beating Hermes in some of these cases. Interestingly, it was more the sort of data layer cases like GraphQL where Hermes showed the most improvement versus JavaScript core, but those are the cases where you're waiting for IO most of the time. You're waiting for network traffic to come in for you to parse in the first place. So you normally do that stuff async and off the main thread in the first place. So anyway, so that's all I'll say. I do like Hermes. I think it has a lot of merit and has earned a lot of merit and stuff like that. But there are still quite a few cases where JavaScript core came out ahead for this corporate sponsor that we're using. And as a result, we use JavaScript core in their app, and we changed our React Native Vision OS app to use JavaScript core explicitly because of that hard data that we had from running on the devices. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention CallStack helped do that benchmarking and set that stuff up.
Do you think, I wonder what are the implications of this release for React Native? And obviously, on one hand, I want to say not too many because of obvious political reasons. But keeping them aside, the fact that we have such a great, first of all, the fact that it ships with so many features out of the box is just crazy. And the fact that we have CSS appears to be pretty comprehensive with animations and all those things. And 3 different types of 3 different types of layout is also pretty awesome. Like one of the blockers I think was sort of subpar experience styling apps on mobile. So I wonder, what does this mean for React Native in practice? Unless nothing, which might be the case. But I wonder how many people will actually switch to Lynx, especially those, I don't know, seeking more features or performance, but we are still to benchmark this.
Well, I think, in 2016, when we were first deploying React Native, the question was like, what does React Native mean for PhoneGap, or what does React Native mean for Ruby Motion? And for organizations that can't move very fast or don't want to move very fast, it didn't mean anything because they had a sunk cost on Ruby Motion, PhoneGap. Kotlin did not exist at the time, if memory serves. I could be mistaken. But also there were like Apple shops that were just like, we are using Swift and that's it, and you can't convince us otherwise no matter what. Right? There were those kind of like native shops where it's like, no, we will have a duplicated 20-person team for every platform that we make an app for, and we will duplicate all of the bugs, and we will whatever. So so you could say, like, what does it mean for the market versus what does it mean for whatever? I think that just like with React Native, there will probably be early movers that then get the advantage of the same sort of wind in their sails that a large technology juggernaut has in their sails. SAILS, like a sailboat. So I think that, Mike, you were there, like with me, like those early days. Like I heard it all. Like, this is dumb. You're stupid. JavaScript as the main thread is dumb. About React Native in 2016, right? People were just like, and it was the same when I deployed React. I was a CTO of a company in 2014 when we first deployed React 0.4. Oh my God, like people were just like, putting markup into JavaScript is the dumbest thing in the world. This will never work. This will never, like, I've heard it so many times from people that are just in a psychological place where they're like, oh no, what does this mean? And they don't have the answer because frankly, a lot of them aren't technical, and so aren't very technical. So I think that there's good things to this, which is it's a different approach. And even if the idea is wacky, I like different ideas and seeing them play out at scale, because that's how we learn.
Yeah.
Humans learn about what
Ma-
works and what doesn't work.
I mean,
But
this is
honestly,
interesting.
did
Yeah,
you
go ahead,
see
Łukasz.
some kind of like criticism of Lynx in social media over the past 2 days? I honestly don't see it. I honestly see excitement in the space, and I see people like actually like playing around with it, making sense of it, but not really in a sense like you mentioned of the early like React days and JSX days and React
Yeah.
Native days.
Yeah. But I was just saying that like people are, what does this mean? Right. And it could mean nothing to people that have a sunk cost on some existing technology. They're not going to do anything tomorrow or next week or next month around this. They'll play with it, form a very like surface level opinion, and then like keep going back and like punching their clock and programming in, I don't know, Objective-C or whatever it is that they're doing at their work every day. This was never going to displace things for a lot of people. But so I haven't tracked the social media response to this, because anything you see me repost on LinkedIn or Blue Sky is on the first page when I open it up to search for something specific. I don't really scroll in social media very much
Trendsetter.
anymore. I'm too busy running a company, and so so I haven't checked the temperature sort of on this with the sort of unwashed masses, as it were. So the thing I think about is, more like, what does it mean for native script?
That is exactly what I'm thinking. And they're already, I would say, I mean, native script might actually be a very good example of what can potentially happen with Lynx as well in the long run. And also the answer to why React Native success is a success. I've spoken to Jamie Birch, and he's pretty deep in that ecosystem. And we had a discussion lately why, like I was asking him, why didn't native script become more popular? Because when you look at it, like to me, I cannot really pinpoint any obvious issue with it, rather just like I can with Flutter, obviously, for lack of using native primitives. In fact, you can run any front-end framework with it, which is pretty awesome, right? There is no. And then what I heard from him is, for many reasons, one of the biggest reasons was, I wouldn't say the government, but I mean, not the governance or the governance. It was more the sort of meta Facebook, or that sort of community effect really has it. And so I guess part of what can potentially happen with Lynx is how that community will sort of keep developing, and how is the sort of ByteDance's involvement going to be a motivator or potentially not? I would say this might be a huge framework with huge adoption in Asia. Like it's already there. React Native is just getting started there. I've just came back from Japan, and they're totally in a different place as far as React Native goes. They're rediscovering React Native on few occasions right now, thanks to some new developments. So it's not like the world is using React Native and this is a huge disruptor. In fact, I believe this might be a very popular option just outside of our bubble. And what's funny is that it just has so many features that it's becoming a really compelling alternative. Like it seems like a worth trying alternative to just using React Native on a daily basis. Now it doesn't have Expo, and it doesn't have all those dev tools that I believe people got used to that make React Native such a great daily runner. However, from my perspective, there is many companies that we work with on a daily basis that are looking for something tailor-made, custom, faster, and they will not mind as long as you provide them the React interface on the front end and something that runs really fast. So I guess the answer is, as always, it depends. And it's hard to say. But I think this is the first time where I really see a truly compelling alternative in a sense that the number of features supported out of the box is just impressive.
Mhm.
That I cannot wrap my head around. Like the CSS or the grids is pretty interesting. So
Well, they've already
I would say,
operationalized it on TikTok and on a couple of other like billion-person apps, right? Whereas like with like React, those first couple of meetups, the React Wednesdays in like 2014 or whatever year that was, right? It was like Pete Hunt and Sophie and Cheng Lu, maybe Eric Vicente was there also, me and Ryan D, and maybe two other people. Like it was not huge, right? It was a small community because they also hadn't deployed to that incredible scale internally inside of Facebook/Instagram yet. But one small correction, that they do have a dev tools thing here, Mike, for React Lynx. What is it based on and whatever, I don't know, but it does exist and you can find it there on the website if you hunt around, unless they changed it or moved it. There you go, Lynx dev tool. So that
Yeah, I'm
does
trying
exist.
to keep up with the screen sharing with your discussion.
If you
no
can
worries.
try running this in the, like, I would love before we end the live stream to get the app up and running on the mobile. Maybe as we keep talking nonsense here, you can try run it.
We need to talk some
because
nonsense. Get Matt Harget on the phone.
CSS is cool, but I want to see it on device. That's
Actually,
I guess the
like,
ultimate.
to
And what's even
recap,
funny, sorry, I have to say this. Like, they even have Expo Snack with Appium like solution there, which
because
is
you need that at scale. Like you need that to deploy it to 1,000 developers and to 1 billion users, right?
Yeah.
And so
I mean,
we're kind of getting this
I already
more
like the
than React
attitude.
Native was initially, I think.
Yeah, I like
guys,
the
if I can say a few things now. So like
now is your moment.
I did that. Like when we had the initial discussion, like getting this project up and running took me like 2 minutes, honestly,
Okay,
and it's here.
That's why you wanted to give it a live share.
Yeah, I can give you a live share to my
neat.
Xcode and the VS Code, and you can play around with it.
Give it to me and give it to Matt, and let's break it. Just keep in mind it doesn't work with cursor, so no AI coding for us noobs.
I don't have live share. Turns out my live share extension is old. I can try to debug this, but like it is here. It took me 5 minutes to set it up, honestly, and I already changed the text.
I would be tempted to use some CSS here, but I already forgot how to use it because I'm using Tailwind and React Native does not have it. But what happens if you do, for example, let's say you have let's say you have the view, the class name app. If you go to app CSS, you have display flex. Can you change this to display grid?
Probably.
Yeah, it's grid now.
And it broke, like expected.
Yeah, but something changed clearly. Anyway, it's pretty interesting that it does support grid.
Yeah, I think the thing I was saying earlier about React Native and how many people said it wouldn't work, or even like React originally, and this is kind of speaking to what Jamin is saying to some degree, like you need someone who's good at advocating for why you would use the technology. React Native, both times I deployed that at scale, and even Vision OS and Apple Vision Pro. I hope I don't sound like an asshole, more than usual anyway. To me, what's the product driver? And if your product design or your ambition there doesn't require something that's 5% better, it requires something that's 5 times better than whatever it's written in at the time, then you start going like, okay, well, what are not the incrementally better things? What is the what is the multiplier effect better thing? And frankly, the slower people are to adopt, the more competitive advantage you have as an early mover. And I just think that it really comes down to, are you technical enough to accurately gauge what that that this thing has the opportunity, when you look at the total cost of ownership, what is it like to develop in, what is it like to deploy, what is it like to debug problems in the field? When you have that kind of soup to nuts sort of cost model of the given technology, is it still a 5x sort of improvement, or is it still a multiplier of improvement? And that might mean, like in the case of React Native Windows, or in the case of React Native for other out-of-tree platforms or whatever, that the ecosystem wasn't ready to support that at the time, but all that it took was finding partners like Infinite Red or CallStack or this.labs to say, this CLI needs to get better in these 5 ways so that we can have an out-of-tree platform that is never public. Or this dev tool thing has to be better in these 3 ways so that we can credibly deploy this to 700 global developers. And so I think that with Lynx, there's work to do here, probably to smooth it out some, to make it operationalizable by a third party that is not ByteDance. I'll just state that, like, there's something in here that someone will hit a ceiling and be like, oh shit, we need to do something that requires something bi-directional, like a contribution or something like that. That's where I think it will get interesting, because are they staffing this open source project to be able to receive contributions? And you might say, well, of course they are. I think we can all name names of projects that aren't actually built for third-party contribution. They actually don't want it. They want street cred and they want mind share, but they don't actually staff it with full-time employees to be able to field those sort of contributions. And so the thing I look for is not just like, well, is this early technology technically capable? Can it have this multiplier effect on the product outcome? You know, going from 30 FPS to 120 FPS with still great battery life, as an example of something like that. But also, like, what is it like for the design, the interaction between the design teams and the development teams, and the development teams and the support teams, right? And if you're putting a multiplier on those relationships, then you've got a full product org, which is the machine that builds the machine. And sometimes something like Prim.js or Lynx can be kind of ignite that sort of flywheel to start turning organization wide. But in all of the cases that we've talked about, including PhoneGap and RubyMotion, it's like people that are detail oriented need changes that get merged. So then it comes to, what's the vibrancy of the open source technology or sort of project? Is there just one maintainer who does all the work? Is everything going to serialize behind their code review? I'm not saying Lynx has this problem, just saying, like, these are the things I sort of look at, like, is this a thing we can make a bet on? Even React Native Windows, when Microsoft open sourced it, I had a conversation with a couple people at Microsoft where I was just like, we are willing to do the work and pay for the work, but if we do it and we, pass all your lints and whatever else, will you merge it? Or is the work that needs to get done somehow not aligned with your internal direction and roadmap? And thankfully, in that particular case, they were like, no, this is completely values aligned. Like, this is fantastic. And so, but there are other projects where I've done that and like, hey, here's what we need to ship our product responsibly and deliver a rocket to the moon experience for our end users.
Yeah.
Would you merge, if we did this work, would you merge it? And they say no. And almost always, I'm sure there's some exception to this rule, I just can't think of it, I don't like to fork ecosystems. I think that that's typically bad news for everybody. I think it just generates a lot of bad feelings. And probably if you're going to have the overhead of that, you might as well start from first principles and rethink the tech stack and just go like, okay, if we have to do that much work and that much ongoing maintenance to keep these parallel tracks going, like, why even have the baggage of that sort of legacy everything about it in the first place? The thing I don't like about I'm having trouble with Lynx in this stuff right now is with native scripts, it's an OpenJS project, which is it's an OpenJS foundation itself is a sort of a child of the Linux Foundation, if I recall correctly. And I'm going to state a incendiary personal opinion. I think that I'm done pitching in on open source projects that have a single corporate maintainer where there are no rules about transparency and no rules about participation and stuff like that. I think at this point I've seen corporate sort of open source actors not being incredibly authentic repeatedly, to the point where I think it's a company culture problem more than anything else. And I don't think I'm up for pitching in on that. So that's one thing NativeScript has, where it's not incredibly polished, because I don't think it's had a consistent, extremely product-driven sort of corporate sponsor. Making sure, hey, when I npm install this, there's not 19 warnings, which is exactly what React Native had in 2017. Or, hey, when I run the CLI, there's a screen full of like, messages from Cocoa Pods and like a bunch of other stuff, right? It doesn't have that like level of fit and finish. But the reason React Native got that level of fit and finish was because, myself and other people like had our employers be corporate sponsors to clean up a bunch of that stuff in open source in React Native. So someone just needs to have the capital, literally the capital, to do that for NativeScript. On the Lynx and Prim.js side of things, I think it'd be very interesting and a differentiator if because adopting a new technology is a risk. It would be very interesting if ByteDance, sponsored some of that stuff directly themselves, as opposed to someone like, me or CallStack or whatever, trying to find a customer that has a need where this has an ambition for their application, where this is a fit, where we kind of take on all of the risk and all of the cost of sort of trying it out and proving that it's viable for third parties.
Yeah.
That would be a differentiator versus other approaches at this. Maybe Flutter did this as well. I'm not as familiar. Someone could correct me, but that's the way I'm thinking about this versus NativeScript and versus sort of React Native. I would probably still lean toward NativeScript because there is a technical steering committee. There are rules and things around all of that stuff, and not secret handshakes that happen where, hey, make an RFC, and you make an RFC and nothing happens for 6 months. It's because, 9 months ago, somebody had some handshake verbal deal with a former employee of the corporation to not do the thing that you actually need.
Nobody obviously knows what are you referring to.
Yeah,
could be Lynx.
So Matt, you say you have all of that in NativeScript already, and in order to like make those kinds of decisions, you would like look at those things. But at the same time, NativeScript doesn't have, in my opinion, like huge community and huge adoption in like corporate products. Like React Native has much more adoption in corporate products right now than NativeScript. And for this technology, for Lynx, I think like we have to like wait and see, right? Like we need to see the community. I looked at the contributing guide, and for something like all of this, for something that was released 2 days ago, and it was like there is a bunch of things that were released at the same time.
Yeah.
Like it's a whole ecosystem. Yeah. Like it's, for me, it seems very well thought out about like the whole ecosystem and whole pluginability of it. So you have the RSPD, you have the Lynx itself, you have the like framework plugins, and React is only first of them, but there are more to come. You have web as well already. And like it seems that they are aiming for adoption. They are aiming for making this as easy for people to contribute as possible.
And one thing you have to keep in mind is that, and this is where you have to sort of look at this also, like from many angles, not just the open source angle, is, as you can see, this is clearly starting to look like an ecosystem.
Yeah.
And this is more of a parallel universe to React, or any other universe where we have, IDE, we have engine, we have DevTools, pretty much everything. These pieces are starting to come and be open source with a delay if you compare it to React or Facebook or Meta infrastructure, but they're being created. And now, if you want to get the answer why they do this instead of embracing the existing open source technology, I'm afraid this is the answer that nobody will give you. I mean, there are many answers, and Matt already sort of pinpointed a few. But ultimately, it boils down to many reasons, and that is the outcome of that.
Yeah,
One thing that go ahead.
I was gonna say, I agree on the NativeScript thing, but again, to me, it's like it's the same as React Native in 2016 or in 2017, where it was still like, this is crazy, like this is gonna like be a dead end or whatever else. Like that was the reaction from like a lot of people, and I'm gonna get flowery on you for a second, and that is that is all it takes. I tell my child this all the time. You don't need everybody to believe in what you're doing. All you need are 3 buddies. You need like a little Scooby-Doo gang of people who just think like, we could make this work. You don't need 20 people. You don't need 10 people. You need 5 people to all go like, we see the opportunity here. We think we can pull the technology together. And it does not take a lot of capital. It just takes a couple of like a handful of values aligned people chipping away at it to get it done. So in React Native, going and speaking at, Jesus Christ, I don't know, 12, 15 meetups and like whatever else about how we were operationalizing it at BlueJeans, what our opinion was so far. We are also doing it on Windows, which is like a hat on a hat on a hat in terms of crazy risk and things people didn't necessarily want to hear about. But it was because folks like Jamin at Infinite Red, folks like Mike, who had just founded CallStack in 2016, were like, this could technically work. Like let's see kind of what happens. And the fact that, so here's the kind of question to ask yourself regarding NativeScript is, if 5 people step up and have the capital and breathing room just to like chip away at that in a product-driven way, with an ambitious product-driven way, not here's another to-do list or here's another like other sort of also ran sort of application, but something that's actually trying to like really push out the boundaries of a sort of an interaction paradigm or UX for the user. How long would it take NativeScript to come up to speed? I can tell you with React Native, it took about 18 months from beginning stuff at BlueJeans to, getting stuff done at the next employer to, where it's like, hey, this is smoother than it was. There's less errors. There's less warnings. The console is less noisy. There's all this kind of stuff that makes it credible to deploy to 500 developers. Here with with Lynx, they've already deployed it to 500 plus developers, right, in a globally distributed team. It's not just in Menlo Park. It's not just in Mountain View in the case of BlueJeans. It's not just in Redmond, Washington in the case of Microsoft. And so I agree that they seem to have sort of pre-chewed a bunch of that stuff we had to deal with in the early days of React Native here. That's NativeScript maybe still has not pre-chewed yet because of it doesn't seem to be consistent and contiguous sort of capitalization and a real detail-oriented driven product to sort of drive it. So people can fight me if they really disagree, but that's my assertion. The upside with NativeScript is that if you want to step up, you want to be on the technical steering committee, you want to whatever, there are rules about how you engage with that. You can't be locked out or whatever else in a way that is completely opaque to you because of the transparency rules of how those orgs, OpenJS Foundation and Linux Foundation, operate. Whereas with Lynx, I am in a wait and see because it's like, what is that company culture like internally? How serious are they about external success?
I mean,
whatever.
they may as well just transfer the project one day to a foundation. Like I wouldn't be surprised because they're
that's what I would do if I were them. Yeah,
I mean that they really have, like I spoke to a few folks and they really have this attitude that I like, which is, yeah, we're just going to make it. just keep calm and ship it. That's their attitude. And when they ship it, they just ship all the features. So I wouldn't be surprised if they just do it just for the sake of doing that, because they really want that developer adoption. I wanted to ask you, Łukasz, if you did end up pasting that CSS I sent you over, and
I did,
is the reason why it's laggy because of the live stream, or it's just laggy because of the device performance?
I think it's smooth on my end. It's just that when I run 4K streaming and my camera and like probably just the bundler or something, it's it's laggy on my end when it comes to like just streaming.
It is interesting. It is interesting, and I kind of wanted to talk about the CSS part of it. And I felt like if we were going to show those fancy animations, this will be a nicer visual effect. Honestly, I think that I remember when I look back, there is like years of React Native talks on threading, on improvements, and React Native was so simple from the very beginning that I never had to learn it. It was always a gradual improvement. So with every conference, every PR, every new feature, I was, getting more into React Native as we were developing React Native in first place. By the way, LiveShare doesn't work with Cursor, so no need to install the plugin. And so the idea was, it was gradually developing. This one is already very comprehensive, so it will take some time to learn. Very, very recommended. For sure. And so there is the CSS renderer that I sort of got interested. So they have a cross-platform C++ implementation that is a CSS renderer. They use the same implementation on Android and iOS. So first crazy thing is that, at least based on the licenses in those headers, it is their bespoke code. It is not something they borrowed from somewhere, unless they just ignored the license. So they have CSS renderer. And then they have support for selectors, obviously. And that is more of an implementation detail, that they do support those pseudo selectors as well. How they implement it, I was sort of trying to understand how they map the CSS, like how that CSS C++ abstraction translates over to iOS at the end of the day. And then effectively, that is pretty interesting. What I'm wondering is if we can get that CSS renderer and put it inside React Native, and then if the license allows, and see what happens. Same stuff with Node API on top of JSC. Sounds like a lot of code has been already done. Why should we just take advantage of that and see what happens?
Yeah, I think the feedback loop. You can do whatever you want, but the way I would think about it is there are obviously like CSS compliance suites from the W3C. I'm curious how much of those compliance suites that this implementation passes, if it is bespoke. And I'm not against from scratch implementations of these things, but the outcome.
It is massive, though, right?
What's that?
I mean, it is a massive effort. Like one of the reasons why, like one of the arguments that I always heard about why does React Native have a full-blown CSS implementation was just the whole scope of it. And now if you think that somebody would pull the trigger on, this is the team, your goal is to implement a spec compliant CSS renderer and keep up with all the latest features, and there's so many of them, that is crazy effort for a project like that.
Yeah.
I don't know what the coverage. I'm not sure if it's disclosed, but at least based on those randomly generated AI CSS keyframes that we pasted here, seems like at least more than average works out of the box. What is interesting here is they sort of parse it. I mean, if you look at it, it is not that much of a rocket science, in a way that all they do is they parse the CSS with C++ sort of code. They generate some structures that map to iOS and Android. Like in case of animations, they're sort of core animations at the end of the day. So all the CSS transformations and stuff like that, On iOS are mapped to CA layers and CA animations, and on Android they're using animation framework as well. So
the Reanimated 4 already has CSS animations, so like it's already like there in React Native world.
Yeah, but we still they're in beta, and you don't have CSS in first place. So even though you have CSS animation, here's the thing with this as a starting point, you're starting with CSS out of the box. So I can write CSS on web and mobile and get it up and running. And the fact that Reanimated has CSS animation support is nice, but still, I'm not right. It's not like I'm writing CSS with Tailwind and I just copy and paste the code. It's great. I can run it, but it's sort of I'm sort of in a different mental mode. I'm thinking different things. So
yeah. So this is almost like a transpiler where it's kind of transpiling this CSS declaration code into sort of the native animation systems on the device.
Yeah, and same with pseudo selectors, right? So if you have before and after, in case of Lynx specifically, at least if my understanding is correct, and I'm saying my understanding is I'm sort of digesting this code base with help of AI on the side, appears that in case of before and after, or I don't know, first line selection and backdrop, what they have is on each node they have additional properties.
Yeah.
So it's not like they're keeping an additional node in that sense, but at least they are able to recognize that on this specific node for the B4 element, we want to have additional styling. How that translates to a native view at the end of the day is a different story. But this is from the scope of the C++ renderer itself.
Yeah. So I think you could apply the same sort of line of thought about like if it's bespoke from scratch, how could they possibly support everything? Because you just think about the input space being so huge. But just like with Hermes, or actually I'll even go back, like V8 was being worked on when I was a consultant at Google before V8 was released. So I was there in 2006 and it was being worked on. Spoiler alert. I don't think that's a trade secret or anything. But like there was this thing like, oh my God, but there's so much JavaScript out there and how could you even approach it and whatever else? It's like, well, are you trying to run every piece of JavaScript that has ever been produced by humanity up to that point? And is that your intention? And I think if you say no, then you go, okay, you've just reduced the input space. So what are you trying to run, right? And in Google's case, there was Gmail was a thing, and there's some other like innovative apps where there's certain things they couldn't do because the web just wasn't legit. The JavaScript runtimes just weren't fast enough at that time, and so so they had specific ambitious product goals that were driving what they needed to do and what they wanted and needed to sort of see. And so with this CSS thing, again, because they have a billion user product driving it and a fully running and I don't know if it's optimized, a full running sort of product organization around it with designers and engineers and testers and experiments and A/B testing and all this kind of stuff. They just needed to make what they needed to support, those billion or two global users and those hundreds, maybe low thousands. I don't know what their product engineering population is at ByteDance. Maybe someone can educate me on that. And so I would almost guarantee you it doesn't have every feature if we ran the compliance suite on it, the W3C compliance suite on it. But does it even need that? Do you need to implement all the CSS1 quirks that have been displaced by newer CSS features? The answer, I'll make a bold proclamation, is no.
So I guess the question would be, good question, sorry to interrupt, but the question would be, I just got to my head as you were talking about this, is would you suppose that React Lynx was a one-to-one React Native, had one-to-one React Native mapping? Would you just switch the backside to Lynx? And if not, why?
Well, it's easier to try then, because it's just like so. what is that barrier to trying it on your full production app? And the lower that is, the more it becomes well, we're dumb to not try this. We should just try this and deploy it to an internal cohort on test flight or whatever, or the Google Play Store or whatever, and try it for a week and see how we feel about it. Because then you're generating real data, right? It's not hyperbole or conjecture. It's
honestly,
real
like
data.
from my perspective, and also to sort of relate to the previous comment we had here. Maybe you guys can pull it up on the screen again. I think, at least speaking for myself, like, I know that, when you release some new project in our community, whether it's as big as React Native Alternative or fresher React Native or whatever you call it, or as simple as somebody made a library for gradients and somebody else did something like that as well, but just different, it always causes a lot of emotions and people get overly emotional, in my opinion. Like, from my perspective, like, we're in the business of shipping products for our customers. So the fact that we have a second product that is kind of like React Native, but not, and has so many additional benefits, I couldn't be more unhappy. Like, I couldn't be happier. It's higher market share in first place. So I think, from perspective, like, the way I look at it as a great opportunity, to be honest. Hopefully we can build some additional missing pieces on the infrastructure side, like with the enterprise framework. Why we shouldn't just provide the same experience on top of Lynx. Although I have to say, as far as I know these guys, I wouldn't be surprised if give them half a year and they'll do their expo out of the box. And then you'll be like, how is that even possible? These guys pull it off so quickly. Like, honestly, I'm not surprised if they're cooking this. Because when I spoke with the team, when I spoke with Zach from the RS Pack, he was like, oh, you guys are working on Node API? Yeah, we already have that. Whatever. It was just one of the small bullet items on the bullet list that they have. So I wouldn't be surprised if they have it. To me, that's great. Just to give you additional context, I've been working. Last year, I met with Mark Rusavi, and we've been working on, like, we had this crazy idea that, if we look at React Native today, that's my personal view. It's sort of like 10 years old now, and back in the day, we had certain issues. We fixed those issues, or we did workaround for those issues. We did workarounds for those issues. Then we fixed architecture, for example, but the fixes are still there, or the workarounds. And that is the legacy code we have. And so if you look at it from a totally outside fresh perspective, you may realize that we do have a lot of code that is not necessarily needed, or we have a good moment for a totally fresh perspective. So what we did last year with Mark, and he's been tweeting about it lately, is let's start from scratch. Let's take Hermes, let's take Nitro modules, let's connect it all together. And if you think about what Vercel's been tweeting, they were sort of hinting at this as well, is if we were to start today, what would we do different? What would it look like? And what internals of React Native could we possibly change or make better or reinvent or re-engineer or whatever? So to a certain degree, I'm happy to see Lynx, because that to me looks like that fresh additional piece that provides a lot of new things to the table that I feel like we previously were talking about as if they were not possible or just not feasible in the nearest future, like the CSS animations, done. So I think worst case scenario, we'll just move faster now because, well, you cannot say it's not possible anymore. It is clearly possible. But I think it's, an interesting. Now it's going to be interesting. Like, so many interesting, crazy things can happen to this. Like, imagine Expo switched to this. What kind of interesting move would that be?
Well, or maybe a new company comes up that is based on this, and Expo keep doing what they've been doing.
Did you just pitch the idea?
No, somebody
who's writing the checks?
Somebody, yeah, exactly. Well, it's not even that. It's just I love James, Edie, and Charlie. James is just like a real smart guy and a real sweetheart. But I'm thankful every day that there are people who jump out of bed and want to make a platform enabler product like that, because I don't. So I'm grateful and thankful to people like James and Charlie and the team over there. But like, if you told me like, hey, you've got to wake up every day for 2 years and excited about that problem space, it's just not, and that's not me being the arbiter of all taste for everybody, just me personally, like Matt Harget, like something has to like get me really excited to get me out of bed like jump out of bed and just like be ready to like go. It would be, you know, I'd say if someone were to like, let's do this, like this for that, like, hey, it's like the Uber for plumbers, or it's the, you know, it's the Scruff for hamsters or whatever. So it's like it's the, you know, it's the Lynx for Expo or whatever. That might get funding from somebody, but I would probably be asking like, is that disruptive enough? You know, to make yourself like an acquisition target.
But you know what?
We're not doing Shark Tank, so.
I had few discussions with Charlie and James, actually maybe more than few. And I also pitched them a couple of my personal ideas back when I was having some time off from running Coldstack. And they're so down to earth. Like honestly, even if you pitched Expo alternative to Charlie, he would still invest in you. Like if he believes in you, like whatever, he's such a great guy actually. Mm-hmm. And that said, sort of following up to what Jamal said about Lynx, sort of pushing React Native to be better, just like Flutter. I think one additional thing here is that like if we're speaking about who's going to have impact on what, I personally don't think there will be any impact on React Native itself. Like I said, it is like to me there is a huge, you know, you have Meta, you have ByteDance on the other hand. Like for certain companies, like there is always, that is an important information, and they will or will not try either of these frameworks. But I do think this will have huge, just because Flutter is very popular in Asia, and there like ByteDance I think is a name, quite a heavy name in Asia. So I think that will have an impact on, should we use Flutter or Lynx? It will be interesting to see what happens on a lower level within those communities later this year.
What Jamon said, that Flutter and React Native were competitors, but like they also like encourage each other to go further. That was like healthy competition.
Absolutely.
And I see that with Flutter, we didn't have much in common in terms of tools. With Lynx, we can like both frameworks can contribute to like shared ecosystem of technologies. So for example, we can have new libraries, we can have all of those developers that used to work with Flutter come to Lynx and then contribute to the whole new ecosystem that both frameworks can gain from. You know, so like I imagine that React Native will gain much more from competition with Lynx than it gained from competition with Flutter.
Yeah, maybe. I never used Flutter personally, but the person that they kind of hired to be the public face of that, Chris Sells, was a very prominent figure early in the .NET and C# sort of ecosystem, wrote some great books, and that is like the person that you want to be the sort of figurehead leading a new global sort of developer community with a new framework and sort of a new ecosystem. And so, yeah, I'm curious who that person is for ByteDance. They obviously have a lot of charismatic people with great stage who are technical and have great stage presence, which is a pretty dynamite combo. Both at the kind of Pico XR events that I've been at, and then also there's the sort of ByteDance stuff as well. I think that when you have a face for the developer brand, that can help people quite a bit, because then it is like they have a relationship with the person and the tech at the same time, which is, I think, a pretty effective way to do marketing And I think that is one of the reasons why Flutter had the success that it did have. Not comparing it to anybody else's success, but it did have adoption, did have like fans. And I think it's because of the sort of face and the sort of outbound culture that they sort of put on it. And so there are things you can do where you're like, oh, Flutter did a better job at technical marketing on this angle and these things. You can like look and then kind of follow what they did. But the thing I think about is, what is the culture difference that takes the ceiling off of the technical achievement? And usually that culture is the ceiling on what can actually get done, both internally and for an external community. And so trying to figure out how to, Mike knows when I slow down and choose my words that I'm avoiding saying something terrible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the problem is that we're live, so theoretically speaking, there is some footprint of everything that happens. It's not like you and me talking. In those cases, you don't take such longer breaks because
that's true. I just say the
you just throw it.
Yeah. So that to me is what's the competition here, and what is the kind of culture of the containing company, and that is usually gives you the bounding volume of what they're going to be able to achieve. So where it's like, oh, here's a technical marketing tactic, or here's even like a conference strategy, right, that you can copy later. But if those things are not occurring to you internally, then you're always going to be trailing behind. And you can still turn that into value for the developer community and for the sort of end user community that those developers are sort of creating for. But if your culture is, let's follow somebody else around and get high off their exhaust, that's doesn't yield a great sort of outcome, probably. In the sort of longer term. And is that the kind of thing that if you were a CEO, you go like, yeah, this is the year we're going to spend $1 billion copying somebody else's playbook? Maybe there are people who do that. I don't know that that's sort of credible. But you can still get that incremental improvement by going, oh, they did this thing differently. Oh, we'll just adopt that. Like you can totally do that. But if you're spending time doing that, having meetings about it, et cetera, you're not thinking about how do we 10x this whole thing? Like what's the fundamental leap forward that is like JSX, or which was itself based on XAML, obviously. But
it is interesting though that, you know, those companies, like on one hand, you would think that since it's an open source project, we can just use it and that there is certain safety of using such AI project. But then I think one of the reasons why they create their own is you know, part of the sort of technical moat. I mean, it's Bybit, right? So it's a huge company, and probably at certain scale, it just makes sense to ship your own stuff for a variety of reasons. But it's interesting to me that, I mean, it's not so surprising to me that they did it. It is interesting to me that they do have some differences in certain interesting things. Like I'm looking at this screen right now and sort of jumping to a different topic for a second. When I look at their syntax, it is sort of weird in a way that it seems to be JSX, but I always thought that writing scroll view with a dash is a legal sort of syntax. And also why they didn't go with divs and paragraphs. So if they already have CSS, why they just can't use pure HTML? Like what's up with those pseudo elements? That is interesting to me. And I also think you can write class, at least on the web playground. I saw class. I don't know if you write class will work or you have to stick with the class name, but it's still interesting difference to me. I don't know if you guys know
what,
anything.
I like how they use views and text marking this as a proxy component. It's not a div on, like, it resolves to div on the web, but like it is a bridging component that resolves to three different elements on three different platforms. So I like how they didn't go with either of the platform naming primitives. They went with Vue. So
Yeah, they do have some other properties, although I'm not sure. Like, I don't think we have scroll orientation as a attribute on an element. I mean, we don't even have scroll view on the web, right? So that's already broken abstraction. So you're right.
Yeah, that's more of a higher order component than
But still,
these
it's
low level.
lowercase, right? It's lowercase.
it's still
Why it's not
lowercase,
uppercase,
yeah.
right? You know, small
Well-
differences. It's just interesting. And also, it's not React, but LynxJS React. I wonder if that's because just like React Native itself in the early days used to have their own, like its own React copy with renderer.
Yeah.
Maybe let's talk about it. Why do you guys think the React here is 17? Like, what's up with that?
I don't have any internal information to tell you about why they made that decision, but I can tell you my observation and why. Like in our spatial app for Vision OS, like for instance, we are pulling out React, and so there's a couple of things I'm bundling into one thing. So one is I think that, you know, this Marie Kondo, this person who you know, is all about kind of decluttering your life. Like there's like old books I have, you know, like this one that I read when I was in Thailand in 2003 and whatever else. And I keep them because they bring me comfort because I'm not a sane person. But she has this thing where it's like, you know, you like that thing, it gave you a lot of joy, thank it for its joy and then get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
Here's my incendiary thing. Maybe React has had like a great 12 or 13 years, and it's time just to rethink some of this stuff from scratch a little bit. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with it, just that maybe something that was developed in the context of it has to run an Opera 9 Mini on a TV that has 16 megabytes of RAM should be a little bit different at this point, and not like implementation different like Preact, but like completely different based on the modern JavaScript runtimes and the amounts of RAM that we have even on the most smallest of sort of embedded devices. So that's one thing. But in terms of why 17, my observation is that I see a lot of code going into React that seems to be very tightly coupled to very specific kinds of cloud services in terms of server rendering and this certain kind of streaming and the way certain kind of things are set up. I'm personally anticipating that happening more rapidly. And I am in the minority of entrepreneurs that think that getting people addicted to cloud services as a way to reach decacorn sort of valuations is, I don't like it as a consumer of things, where it's like, hey, this app doesn't work offline. As a developer, I really don't like it because then I have to justify to my chief technology officer, like, hey, here's this framework that we want to use, but it kind of couples us to only 2 different providers of cloud services, and that duopoly isn't enough competition.
But don't you think, Matt? Don't you think that one of the reasons, like people keep saying, I saw somebody making jokes that it's not even React 19, it's 17. But at the same time, my question is, to your point regarding cloud features and all those latest features, why should it be? Like if React itself, okay, there were some breaking changes between 17, 18, 19, hence the major version bump. But the primitives are still the same. And if the framework is not leveraging React server components because it doesn't even have them, Like,
Yep.
what are you effectively, like, what is the real issue here? Like, you still have use effect, state, callback, like
and
same
suspense.
stuff.
And suspense. You have suspense. You have
Exactly.
the atoms to do really awesome data loading, but also having ported React to Lua when I was at Roblox. Like, and we started with React 17 because that's when we started the project. We were actually working off of the main branch of React. So there's a few little React 18 like feature flags and stuff that are in that React Lua implementation. But part of it was like, why didn't we jump to 18 after we deployed 17 successfully in Lua on Roblox? And the reason why was because it was like, and this is not disrespect to anybody, because this is like a hard problem where it's like, oh, now we know how to do data loading. Oh, wait, no, we don't. So we're not going to do that for 18. It'll be in 19 instead. So there were these kind of, it was not clear to me bringing React into Lua, is there enough, like, did they really figure this out at scale internally inside of Facebook and Instagram and Meta in general? And it seemed like the answer a couple years in a row were no, not quite. Here's the thing I appreciate about React and React Native and Meta is that, my advocation for this technology since React in 2014, so over 10 years now, was this has been battle hardened against hundreds, now tens of thousands of developers and deployed to hundreds of millions, now billions of users. And and at the time, I also I felt a reasonable handle on the personalities that were involved in making those decisions. And I'm like, if they haven't figured it out yet, it's not from like a lack of trying, and it's not from a lack of trying experimental things. They just haven't found something that works at scale yet, either from a developer productivity perspective, from a field supportability perspective, like usable crash reports, or from some kind of performance perspective. And so letting that bake longer is not a bad idea, especially if you're trying to be both innovative and risk averse at the same time. Like they're kind of absorbing the blast of that risk taking for you. So for porting React to Lua for React 17, it's like, yeah, but React 18 will have these other features, whatever. And I was like, I'm not sure that they're sure that they've got some of this stuff quite figured out yet. But also a lot of the React 18 features all involve server components, which for Roblox's business case that I was operating in at that time in 2020 was not a thing that we needed to care about at that time. So when you look at like, what does React 18 and 19 have that aren't related to server components and hydration and some of this other stuff? What are the fundamental improvements to suspense and whatever else? It's not that there aren't any. It's that you have kind of what you need with React 17, and also at some point you just have to stop chasing upstream and just demarcate.
Yeah, I mean, there is actually a lot of people in the community that feel like, they sympathize with React as it used to be a very simple view library without all the external additional APIs. And so I feel like, like to me, React is not really like React JS and React Native are, I would say, libraries in the React ecosystem. To me, React is more of a mental model for building apps.
Yeah, sure.
And I can see, I can see myself creating another library or using Preact or using something else and still feeling like I'm coding with React. So to me, it doesn't really matter that this is React 17 or whatever, but it's sort of in the React ecosystem mental model thing,
Totally.
which is what makes it compatible for me, at least for my mind, to start working with. And that is, I think, a huge difference and why we shouldn't really care about it. Maybe treat it more like an implementation detail. And it will be interesting because I know the guy on the RSPAC team, Zach. He's working very closely with Jacob on the repack, which is, again, bringing module federation to React Native. And they will have module federation working out of the box with Lynx as a first-class citizen, which obviously a huge no-brainer for the whole market because all the Asian apps, like most of them, I mean, almost that's a wrong word, but it is a very popular use case. That's what I'm saying, where you have a super app with federated modules, and we see a lot of interest from that region. And the fact that it is going to be a first-class citizen is huge, and that is very interesting to me. They may have React Server Components implementation at some point, and I'm sure they will. And what's funny, it will probably be more comprehensive than what we have, and it will ship with an entire server stack as well. Whether they use it or not, I don't really know, but they will do it. That's 100%.
But actually,
and
like,
the point is, it might not even be React 19. It might be whatever else. Like, I've already seen them tweeting about using, directives for switching threads. Sort of embracing the React Server Components mental model for different things on the mobile, which is also interesting. And again, might not be React 19, which doesn't mean it will not build up on those features.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly that. Like, they don't need React features. They can just create their own features and expose them to all of the frameworks.
Right.
That's all.
Yeah. And that I think is like how do you take one step backward to take a leap forward?
Yeah.
It might be that they have a different point of view about the intent of the capability of server components that is different. Not just it's the same API and different implementation, but that is completely different because it's not based on the same sunk cost of data center infrastructure and a bunch of other layers of organizational cruft that have built up either inside of Meta or at Vercel or at Expo or whatever else. And I'm not disrespecting anybody by saying cruft, like it happens. Same people working together, working this kind of same way for a while and that kind of stuff. And so they've got a deeper context stack that they're developing against. Whereas if you had a different context stack that you were developing against, where you also weren't trying to build a cloud-based business around it necessarily because your business is, TikTok or Pico XR or whatever, genuinely. And if you also had the perspective of, well, we don't need to lock people in because we have a different fiduciary responsibility, so we don't need to constantly be playing a zero-sum game with developer mindshare acquisition. It would be very interesting. I would be personally very excited to see what they do in a slightly different attitude context than what some of these other companies were either founded around or are currently executing against. I think if they were going to do the same thing, like, okay, we're going to do this, but 5% better, I'll hit the snooze alarm and sleep some more that day. But if it was like, here's a completely different way to think about this that is based on everything in Prim.js and, Node.js 24, there's some new capability that fundamentally at the data center hardware level, at the mobile hardware level, at the bleeding edge of JavaScript runtimes, unlocks some 10x performance per watt or whatever it is, that isn't limited by someone making a slide deck 3 years ago having to really like strong arm internal teams into using server components or React Native or something like that, and now they can't change what they said because they used certain tactics internally to coerce people into adopting the technology. If you kind of take that stuff out of the equation and just really go, what is the best for the end user's mobile battery life and performance? What is best for data center costs and for supporting both of those things in the field? There's probably a different constraint solve for those things that would be interesting to see, that I would be personally diving into the code.
What's interesting is if they decide to implement, or once they implement React Server Components, to your point, it may actually come from a totally different package. Like, speaking of the different direction that the team is undertaking, for example, like you said at the beginning, the direction might be that there will be LynxJS/RSC, and that won't really be a React per se, which is either good or bad, depends how you look at it. But from a perspective that you won't be able to use React 19 if you have React server components that come from different place. It is interesting because all these things are not really documented that well, I guess, like the whole React flight protocol and how the React server components are working under the hood. I don't think that's like super public information. But I'm sure they can reverse engineer that without any problems.
But do they need to? Because their whole thing is, with these two threads and the way that they're coming at this, is here's how fast things get on the screen, right? Super duper crazy fast. And so kind of doing some server-side rendering-ish sort of things and then transferring it over and then rehydrating it and all this other kind of stuff. Do you still need that if your time to interactive is under 300 milliseconds?
Yeah, and you have federated modules, which is also an interesting alternative. I mean, not an alternative one-to-one per se, but it lets you pretty easily ship runtime code, which sort of addresses certain concerns of React server components for certain use cases, such as dynamic UI display.
Yeah, and I think that that's sort of using module federation remotes as a way to sort of ship a pre-rendered or sort of a pre-processed build that kind of just, again, it's a reduction, but gets live data on screen faster, right? Not stale data, not blinking gray boxes, but the user sees stuff, they're entertained, they start to scroll or whatever that your app sort of does. It seems like rather than having the server render that for truly custom things for each one of the billion users that attaches, that seems to be the most capital intensive way to come at this problem. And for people that like to have a big flex on their private data centers, like, well, we don't care because we have our own data centers. Like, well, you still care about cost and you still care about capacity. You don't not care. But for some people that are trying to make a flex, or they're open sourcing something that they know will work for them, but that will be an unscalable business for anybody that adopts it. And so they get to have the street cred of open sourcing something, but people won't find out that it doesn't scale when using a third-party cloud like Azure or GCP or whatever, until they're enough of a competition to be an acquisition target, you know. So yeah, I think that there's a bunch of the ways that Prim.js and Lynx, and I do quite like the way that it's all developed in context to each other, where it's like, it is this JS runtime optimized for this presentation layer, which is optimized for these platforms with this sort of CSS transpiler sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think that instead of it being piecemeal added, and they've kind of developed these all in the same context, that it gets these integrations that yield this user visible outcome of, you know, like being interactive with semi-customized, like semi-personalized content in a very short amount of time. The thing that, as I say this, here's what's exciting, is that if they figured out a way to get that semi-personalized sort of thing to users, where maybe you don't have a billion experiences for that first page, but you've got, let's say 10 million or 50 million or something like that, you can pre-build and pre-compute all that stuff, and RSPress makes that super duper fast and very efficient in a bunch of ways. And you're just using module federation remotes as the CDN for those 50 million, you know, first 3 images in the photo scroll. It would be interesting for someone to do the math who's deeper on sort of the operations, data center operations side. It seems like that means you can serve personalized stuff to 50 million variations, 100 million variations of personalized stuff to the majority of the world at a fraction of the data center costs, because most of it goes from real compute to just CDN, content delivery network stuff. If I'm making some leaps here, if that might actually be the headline to this whole thing, not that they made a React compatible app framework, but that by using this and using this approach, your OpEx and CapEx, operational expenses and capital expenses for your business for cloud compute might have just gotten cut in half or more with this approach. I'm not quite educated enough working knowledge of that stuff to do the math, but that might actually be what the headline of this is that they're able to do this in not for, $1 billion in data center costs per year, but $100 million in data center costs per year. And if that multiplication translates to smaller scale, then it's the difference between like an AI startup using OpenAI APIs. I love OpenAI. I use ChatGPT all the time, but using some cloud AI provider versus running an LLM locally. One startup has operational costs that are variable and outside of their control. And at some point in their scaling, if they're successful, they'll have to come to Jesus about that, versus someone who's running an LLM locally that's fine-tuned for the specific workload, and it just runs on the developer's device. In the latter case, their data center costs stay relatively fixed because they can have 100 million users, but the LLM inference all runs on the user's device, not in the data center on giant GPUs. And in the other case, it runs in a data center on giant GPUs. And this might actually be the more exciting piece of this. If they get semi-custom stuff on screen within 200 milliseconds, and it's using a CDN approach and not a data center compute approach to do that, then that's kind of a big deal versus, and that business difference, that operating expense difference would be a game changer for startups, because it's like, okay, once we get to 1 million users, we're going to have an Azure spend. Again, I'm not picking on anybody particular. We're going to have a GCP spend of $1 million. And basically our customer acquisition costs and our customer retention costs are going to be this amount of money that we have to pay out to the cloud provider to be able to do that. Versus, well, we just have to pay Netlify to do CDN stuff. That costs basis for running the business and retaining the users being a different multiplier means that you could probably scale to 1 million users before you have to go for your A round, for instance. That's kind. If I'm connecting those dots correctly, that's kind of a big deal, probably. But not on the technology side, sure, but it enables this business outcome that is a multiplier or a divisor. And that's potentially very interesting to new startups. And the capital.
But for that, we still have to wait and see like what direction they will actually enable us to go. For now, what we have is web UI, not web, not necessarily those like web micro frontends, right? Like not necessarily anything new from web micro frontends.
Right. Yeah. But the thing that's interesting, it is kind of existing inventory. It's all pieces that we sort of already have, but it's like the full integration of them together seems synergistic to me. Like they add up to be greater than the sum of their individual parts. But it's my conjecture here. I might be making sort of a leap here that is incorrect. I'd love for someone to correct me if that's the case.
Matt, maybe let's switch gears and talk about like the actual dev experience. Szymon has been hacking with,
I see,
with the
yeah.
app for a while. So our setup is
let's give him a proper code review, Matt, like from back old days at Sony.
So our setup is he's working through how is it called? Live share from Microsoft.
Okay.
And he's just coding on my setup. I need to constantly like shut down the app and the dev server because like sometimes it doesn't pick up the latest changes.
Okay.
It doesn't have the alert, so we established that. But for the rest, Szymon, can you walk us through your implementation?
Sure. The most interesting part for me personally is that when you go to the style sheet app.css, you will see I used end function to get the safe area inset, and that works out of the hood. Like, if you want to have this in React Native, you have to use some kind of custom components and so on and so on. But in Lynx, it's built in.
Nice.
It's the same as in web browser, so that's good. For some time, I thought there's no support for more complex selectors, but it turned out it's not the problem with Lynx, it's the problem with the live reload. For some reason, it's basically turning off every 6 changes, something like that.
But like we also got a bunch of errors at the beginning when we tried to create a complicated CSS with cursor, and it just shut down. Like I can like go back to this later, but we got a bunch of errors that something is not supported from CSS. So
I think it's when there's something non-supported, the CSS engine just shut down.
Yeah, it just doesn't work. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's.
But what is this? What is this syntax anyway? Like, forgive me my CSS ignorance, but what is
which one?
end?
This
old school CSS. Yes. Old school CSS.
Shouldn't be var.
We have functions now. No.
Oh, okay. Now. Jesus. Okay, I'm Tailwind guy, so I'm not getting that deep.
Yeah, in CSS nowadays there are many functions. They are even adding CSS functions like JavaScript in CSS.
Oh,
I
neat.
think it's called. I don't remember the name. I think it's Houdini, CSS Houdini, Project Houdini, something like that. Yeah. So ends work, I guess, by looking at the initial example, CSS variables also work just fine.
Great.
I'm not sure about pseudo classes like hover.
Yeah, try with the before. Oh, hover will be nice. Actually, hover will be nice and focus.
I think the before and after is in the initial example as well.
You think so?
Yeah, I think so.
How do they change? Like, I wonder what's this button active supposed to do? Like, do they have?
It's just this.
Is there a custom property? Okay, okay.
It's just a class that Szymon is applied to the element.
Yeah, exactly. It's just old school.
Exactly. That's comment directly towards me. I'm more than happy to show it.
Tailwind folks.
Tailwind. Yes.
Okay. No, I don't think it works, to be honest. But I'm also not a CSS like day-to-day guy. Yeah,
that seems pretty legit.
I think so.
I was actually Szymon, you're doing this like, let's say, dummy navigation here, right? Like we are just like changing elements. I was trying to find in the docs about navigation here. I couldn't find any examples. So I just like imagine you would import just routers from WebWord to do that, or what? What do you think?
Technically, yeah. I mean,
React
why not?
Router, huh?
Exactly.
Now you don't have any router on the web because they all are servers. So you have to do React Router v2.
But like React Native its power comes from being native, right? And we have that native navigation. I didn't see that yet. Like I haven't looked as well, but I haven't seen like native navigation here yet. So what about like the iOS gestures and stuff like that? So like navigation is one of the parts that needs to be native here. And if it's not yet, like this is a space to improve, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily be, I mean, you can always recreate native navigation in JavaScript. That's what we have with React navigation. You have those JavaScript powered navigators, which are similar to native counterparts, maybe not perfect, maybe not one-to-one replacements.
Well, there is a reason why we have React navigation that's native.
I know.
And there is a reason why we have like React Native screens from Software Mansion.
Performance. That's one of the reasons. Because with navigation powered with JavaScript, you have to fight for your execution time. You have to basically handle everything in this 16 milliseconds time frame to render in 60 FPS, right? So it's not only your code, the navigation code, the animation code, but also rendering and other things going in the background. That's why offloading to native is way better for such cases.
Yeah, you really just want to dispatch the native operating system and let it do whatever it's going to do, but do that in a way that does not hold up your main JS thread, right? And so, and this is easy to say now, but it took a few rough years there for people to figure out a way to do that scalably. That said, I think that, and screens is great, and React navigation is great, but this is another situation where it seems like even though React navigation obviously has been through several amazing rewrites, truly, like it was like a game. It's like, okay, navigation
from the static API to declarative API, back to static API, and guess what's next?
But that's a really great example of just going like, we got to do what we got to do.
Full circle
for experience and whatever else. But I wonder if you took someone fresh who didn't have to make any of this work on iOS 6. I'm not picking iOS 6 in particular, but just like Android API 18 or 15 or 12 or whatever. And you're just like starting from now, where the operating systems and the hardware that they're running on and all this other stuff are just in a completely different universe, context-wise. If you wiped that context of old legacy operating systems clean, there's no reason you couldn't do something pretty fucking amazing and different that would feel more modern and probably be a little bit more straightforward than some of these other approaches that have had to evolve and support, older operating systems. So if they don't have it here in this first open source drop that they've done, obviously they have something because they have multi-screen navigation in TikTok and their other apps. But this is another thing where it's potentially like a really great opportunity just to go like, yeah, we don't have to support skeuomorphism and those navigation styles or the whole screen flashes like in navigation of early Android and whatever else. What can we do? What thread can we run it on? Every phone now has 6 core CPU cores in it and like a couple of dedicated GPU cores. What does that mean? Like, what does that fundamentally change? And maybe reanimated as screens have already folded this in, and I'm just not aware because I don't track those projects super closely myself. But it's another thing where I just get kind of excited because it's like, yeah, what would you do if you only had to support, Android API? I don't know what's up to 30 or something. What if you only had to support the oldest phone in, Bangalore, India, which is probably an iPhone 9, 10, maybe 11, something like that.
What's interesting? You just reminded me of that. There is one from the book from the shelf of crazy ideas that I have. This is probably as crazy and stupid as it gets, but continuing on that research of what would happen if you didn't have to support all the old devices, and what if you wouldn't need to deal with all the legacy code. I landed on a rather interesting conclusion that if your solution is to sort of fundamentally create a new framework, like in this case, what would my React Native look like if I didn't have to support some legacy APIs? Then I landed on this realization that maybe there is never going to be a successor or any follow-up in that regard. And the alternative here would be that what if LLMs can get good enough for pure translation of the code across platforms? Because ultimately what React Native is trying to solve is how can my code run on 5 platforms at the same time? If you can get a tool that will effectively get you that 80% done and then keep it in sync, you're done, right? To sort of certain extent. So that is yet another what if that I can add to your to that discussion. Eventually, I think I'm not going to be surprised if that thing happens at some point, because theoretically, what's stopping you from translating iOS to Android? I'm pretty sure LLMs would do it easily right now. And then
a thinking model, sure, yeah. That seems technically feasible to me. I just think about if you're one developer, if you're a company of one, I just think about how do you scale that practice. The way I think about applying LLMs into this space is a little bit different, which is I think what you would want to do is have an LLM create the transpiler, and that you then kind of adjust, or that you do the starter of, and you say, now expand this to support the rest of the iOS 17 and Android API 38 or whatever controls. So I think that using LLMs to create this interstitial tooling, this glue sort of tooling, rather than having the LLM run the inference to do the translation, is the way I would think about it. But I think that what you're saying is totally technically feasible with a properly trained model. And that is a thinking model that is able to kind of talk itself out of its own hallucinations. Right? That's been the biggest leap forward lately. And I did try Claude Sonnet 3.7 last night, actually. And I just, I gave it the full context of our code base. And I said, make the Swift side of this faster and the JavaScript side of this faster. And it came up with diffs. And this time, instead of it being complete bullshit that is completely invalid, like doesn't make any sense, it did not understand our code at all, it was only half bullshit. There were really great optimization suggestions that were in there that still took time for me to review and like double check, but that were solid. And so the trend line is there. Like it's getting better.
Honestly, like that is a topic for another live stream. Like I've been vibe coding the website lately, and when you get to the point where you're just using AI from the beginning to an end, you don't even care about the output as long as it looks good, you know. So at least that's the benefit of doing that on the website. We can do a follow-up to this one day. I want to have guys, if you can just maybe tell us a bit more about all the weird things you have there. Like, do we even have an app? Like, for the record, I have to drop in 10 minutes, but you can keep going. Actually, you know what's funny is that, and I think this is the request for ourselves and also my personal experience, is that those live streams, when I was doing those live streams on my personal channel, the longer you do them, the better. I mean, the best results I was getting when I was doing like 8 hours long. You could think it's crazy, but you just have to sort of make it part of your daily job and just roll with it. 8 hours, then you had like 1K. And you can see by the number we're growing steadily. So it's always pain in the ass to say, you know what, I have to go because my 2 hours buffer is just wrapping up. And I maybe would reconsider if it was 11 p.m. already. But I wanted to say that maybe you guys can do a recap over what you have inside the app. And then feel free to stay for longer. But that would be a great moment to check what else we have here, except for this half-cut text and non-working before element and using Lynx instead of window, which is also interesting.
Okay,
Lynx is a
that's
global,
maybe-
right?
So this is
have-
like
Yeah.
writing this is like writing jQuery now. The observer
Exactly.
relative to, scroll to.
Like I have a list of things that are present in the web environment, missing in React Native, and present in Lynx. And
Okay.
the intersection observer is one of those things.
Yeah, that was in my notes. I was super excited about that for ads. Like you have to have a working intersection observer to be able to serve ads that are
I've been using that lately. You know, I haven't done any web coding for like many years. So when I got into coding new website and implementing sticky sidebar with sections, and I'm like, wow, what kind of magical API is that? You know, it's pretty cool.
It's really important if you have an ads-based business in your app, because there are, in the US and I assume in the EU as well, there's these really distinct rules about how much does the ad scroll on screen and is visible before it counts, and you can say that the user saw it and then charge money to the person for advertising costs. There's all these rules around it. An intersection observer is the hardware accelerated way to do that. That is fast and performant. And we had to build it at PlayStation because it just didn't exist in the ecosystem at all. It's like one of these weird holdbacks. It's not weird, depending on how much of a conspiracy you think that there is, but like where it's like anybody building an ads-based business needs that capability. And in 2018 or whatever year it was when I started working on the ads part of the React Native PlayStation framework, and thinking about the monetization and some of the other things that we needed it for, I was like, there was nothing. Like it had to be built, and it was so. It so relies on a bunch of native graphics stuff that you can't really outsource it, or do it in pure JavaScript. The performance would be terrible, and also it wouldn't be accurate enough to follow those IAB sort of guidelines for
So
ads.
like for now, we were able to import it, like use it, but it doesn't seem to work. Like we were not able to make it work yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
You finished too soon. But yeah, another nice thing when somebody comes from the web environment is that you can use selectors even outside of the CSS. In React Native, you only have the option the only legal option is to use refs. There you can easily target elements by IDs, by classes, I guess by any complex selectors you can think of. We didn't check that, but that could work technically. What else?
You mean here, right?
One interesting, you know what's interesting here or / scary is that with React Native, whether it's good or not, we have a certain subset of features, and that at least makes it working in one expected way. When you open this Pandora box of you can write any selector and you can get a ref to a outermost parent from within the innermost child, it's like, what the hell is even going to happen in this?
Okay.
That's where I think about field supportability. When there's a bug,
it's like,
how much does it cost?
I'm starting to think that web itself is just a different paradigm. It's on one hand, it's great to have its features working inside mobile. At the same time, I have mobile native development background, and I'm just like, my head is blowing with like having those. Yeah, that's just crazy.
There's a piece of this in terms of supporting it at scale. And so with refs, thinking about code analysis and trying to find bugs using static code analysis, whether it's Flow or TypeScript or whatever. It seems like with refs, you do have to be very explicit, but that makes it so that your static code analyzer can follow what's happening and hypothetically in a better way. Like from a computer science, like algorithms and like proofs perspective.
Yeah.
With it being a little freer here, while it's nice because it's more fluid and there's less characters to achieve the same thing and whatever, there's maybe seemingly looser coupling between these things as well. it seems like it would make that code analysis verification significantly more challenging. And I don't think code analysis is the end all be all for making sure you have quality at scale, with dozens or hundreds of engineers. I think unit testing and integration testing is also super important. But that's my spit take about the selectors being able to come from anywhere, is it seems like it would make software proofs and code analysis more challenge, make something that's already pretty hard even harder. But maybe if you had a quantum computer where where all NP hard algorithms sort of become easy all of a sudden, maybe that's the future that they're developing for here, or I'm just misunderstanding, which is also possible.
All right. So question to everyone. We have a single event handler with event, which is a parameter. What type is it?
It's
and the answer is, it depends. Because we have those two threads, main thread and this background thread. Event handlers can work on both threads.
Are you saying it's a different depending on the thread?
Exactly. Like on the main thread, it's an object.
Oh, wow.
On the background
So now
thread, it will be a JSON object. Like.
Oh, interesting.
So can we say that your function is not thread safe if you do not handle both cases?
Technically.
But the from a source level perspective, you access them the same way, right?
Right. But some properties, some methods will be missing because you cannot serialize methods.
Yeah, this is a problem in Lua also, where Lua you couldn't have properties on functions, and React sort of relied on that in a few places. But this is one of the things that was interesting about this two-thread approach we talked about, but we did not talk about how they represent some of these prototypes and objects completely differently, purely for execution speed reasons. And so this is probably what it boils down to. Is this difference in the types that you're seeing. What I think is cool is that somehow your VS Code setup or whatever has the context to know if I'm in this file or this handler, this prototype or this type is different versus when it's in this other context. That's pretty neat from a type solver and annotation perspective. So you actually have that annotation, right? Like that shows up for you.
Well, I hover on this, right? And then my VS Code says that this is the type that I'm looking for. But I'm not sure if this changes between environments. Like, I'm not sure if this is aware in which environment.
I think you are missing some kind of plugin, like Lynx plugin for VS Code, because what you see is probably you need to have something like that because they're adding some new attributes, or at least they should kind of patch types DOM package for TypeScript.
Yeah.
Well, I do have those. Like, I'm importing from this, and this is probably typed. Like I have types for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you may be right.
I have types already.
You can try go to the source code of event handler and see what is it.
Can you say again?
You can go to the source code of event handler.
Source code of event handler. Well, that's
command
type.
plus left. Okay, that's type.
Well, yeah, it should be type, right?
So I think it doesn't really show you the difference.
Yeah, here's a question. So with on the web, or even with reanimated worklets, there's also some type differences there, right? There's some things you can't do. This is how disconnected I am from daily coding. Does VS Code know the difference for that, or TypeScript know the difference for that as well? that it knows, hey, I'm in a worker, therefore these types are slightly different. There are these certain methods I can't call.
I don't think so.
Yeah. So this
I'm
seems
not
like
sure.
a
I
general
didn't know.
problem then, right? Like where it's not context aware enough. And again, that'd be hard. The configuration of it would be a nightmare. So I'm not dissing TypeScript or whatever. Just but it seems like this main thread, background thread thing has the same tooling challenges then as when using service workers, web workers, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you have to pass serialized objects, probably as a JSON. So
Yeah.
there is some kind of performance penalty.
And the IDE is not going to help you exactly. I'd be fascinated to
exactly.
WebStorm, because WebStorm I would expect to be 5 steps ahead of everybody else. Maybe WebStorm has the awareness and context.
The problem is that with workloads in React Native, the only way to distinguish them is to parse the abstract syntax tree and to look for the use worker string. That's the only kind of marker. You cannot you can statically say that a function is a worker, but still it's not something common enough for TypeScript to implement.
It's technically feasible. Just there's not a the people who are technical enough to be making workers and service workers and whatever and going that deep on the product are perhaps don't rely on the IDE feedback as much as other people who are doing more typical web app development, perhaps. And so it's not nearly as much of an acute pain as it is otherwise. It's also possible that other IDEs figured this out.
I found the router. I found the router in the docs.
Oh, cool.
So it's React Router.
Yeah, you should use React Router, basically.
Oh, great. Well,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, this is what we thought. It's just that if I search for navigation, it doesn't show like that, but because it's routing. So like
right.
Okay.
Wrong keyword.
It kind of means that 60 frames per second will be hard. At least.
Yeah, but also
right now.
like you have one note on like the whole ecosystem, right? Like so we were looking at Lynx itself and about the guides here and about APIs here. We were also supposed to, we are also supposed to looking at all of that. So like React Lynx, right? And then the guides here, is it different? Introduction. So the introduction here is different. We have also like pages about data fetching, state management, and routing. So I didn't see that like from the other perspective.
But those technically just use React. I mean React libraries.
Yeah, but like this is the similar discussion that we had like an hour ago, right? Because we were thinking, so how are they architecting the whole ecosystem? Maybe the ecosystem will be architected from one step behind, from one step back, not from the React perspective, but from the system perspective. It seems that like right now, the options are for it's only React the option, but also like options for architecting are React based. Those are not like system based. There are not like system level ways of doing things. Those are React way of doing things. For now, I don't like, maybe in the next few months we will see some other like patterns emerge.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like now I know that React routers, I think what they have here in publicly on open source. But like, I don't remember there being super janky like navigation transition problems in TikTok or their other apps.
Well, it's not. So this doesn't work on TikTok yet. So this works on. Let me see if I can find it.
On the other hand, if you have CSS animations, those are probably driven by some kind of, I don't know, some other thread. So animation should be fluent.
Okay. So there might be these sub tabs, if you will, of the
Yeah.
TikTok app that
So there is a
aren't as
search
smooth.
panel on. So TikTok Studio is like the fully based on Lynx. Then Shop tab
Okay.
is based on Lynx, and then like two apps like Disney 100 and the Met Gala.
Mhm.
Those are also based
Interesting.
on Lynx.
Yeah. Anecdote. A bunch of parents at my child's school all use the shop tab in TikTok. I don't know if that is indicative of a broader population using it, using the shop tab or whatever. But yeah, I'd be interested. It'd be interested for someone who is not us to get the TikTok app, take it apart, and then identify the pieces of it that aren't yet in this open. I haven't been part of this open source release yet. And then it would be interesting to then talk to someone from ByteDance and say, for these pieces that you have not open sourced, are you planning to? Is there some private API? 'Cause
Yeah, like definitely. I need to put that on the schedule. I know that there were some comments in the chat to Jamon if he's going to like do an episode on React Native Radio about this.
Mhm.
I definitely want to do an episode about this on. Sorry, it's already late. I forgot the name of my podcast. React Universe on Air. The React Universe on Air. So like probably I'd wait a couple of months for this to stabilize and to see the reaction from community and to see like the usages of this. But definitely I'd love to interview the architect for this or someone from the dev team working on this on the daily basis, or like you either using this or like working directly on making this happen.
Yeah.
To like know their perspective.
Write it down and try to reach.
Yeah,
somebody
we
from
should
the
write
team.
it down. Matt, I already am speechless. Like it's quite late and like I'm tired. I'm gonna drop, and I know that Szymon is going to drop. Do you want to continue?
No, I'm here. I'm here for you all. So.
Oh yeah, thank you. So any like wrap up words about this? Like what did we figure out over the past 2.5 hours?
Something definitely is wrong with live reload of CSS files.
Yeah, that's a bespoke implementation, and for these things that are, it's based on Preact. Preact has its own test suite. Something we didn't dive into is like, what's the test coverage in open source of these things? That would be interesting to kind of see. But whenever there's a new thing introduced like this, there is a pretty standard reaction from people that have a sunk cost in the previous technology, whatever it is, right? You saw like Java people reacting to C# and .NET a certain way. You saw certain React Native people reacting to Flutter a certain way, and stuff like that. But there's always opportunity in those moments for people that are deeply technical, that can look at the technology, not without emotion, but just to figure out technically, deeply, what is the difference here. And it can be something that is seemingly small. Like with React Native, it was the async bridge for me. When I learned that the async bridge and about the async bridge in React Native, which doesn't exist anymore because of bridgeless mode, and how it worked, I was like, this is the fundamental difference between PhoneGap and Ruby Motion and these other attempts to do this. And it sounds like a micro tactic or like some weird nerdy detail, but that is the multiplier effect on the kind of experiences that we're going to be able to deliver with stock sort of JavaScript talent pools that we sort of had in our geographies. And so I think that in each one of these points, there is an inflection of some kind, a technical inflection that enables a product inflection. It's just who realizes it first and who is able to move on it. And does that instantly mean that they all become billionaires and live happily ever after? No, because making a product is hard, and the technology choice is one of 100,000 decisions in the first couple of years. But there's a lot of indicators here that the folks at ByteDance are thinking about things differently, which is great. They're not trying to be 5% better. They're trying to do something completely different. And I appreciate that. Even when something is wacky and doesn't make sense, all this makes sense to me for the most part. But even when something is wacky and doesn't make sense, I always appreciate when people have the commitment and the follow through to try something totally different, try to operationalize it in a shipping product, especially when you're hitting millions or hundreds of millions of people. You get a ton of learning and data out of that. And even if you learn this won't work, you know, here are the 3 reasons precisely why something wouldn't work, as opposed to a lot of hyperbole and conjecture and whatever else. And so we talked earlier about like, you know, who would move on this, or do we wait, or do we whatever? These are the same conversations about React Native in 2016. It's like, who's going to use this? Should anybody use this? Who's going to be the first person to move on it? And just in my bias and my professional experiences, the first adopters of these new technologies are people that have ambitious product goals. They're not making the 9,000th to-do list app, or like the 50,000th photo scrolling app, like doom scrolling app, right? They have some different idea that they're trying to, where they are trying to do something completely different that isn't on anybody's sort of radar. Those are the people who are probably the most interested in something that is going to be a multiplier effect on their app development side, and not to complement their ambition on their app and product and solution design side. So that's where I would expect to see the first movers come at here, just like it was for React Native back in 2016. But yeah, it's been a great conversation. It was great to see Szymon and you all typing live code and seeing what works and what doesn't. I'm actually very pleasantly surprised by how much did work just from seeing you guys mess around. This is probably the best day one or week one open source release of this magnitude.
And we shouldn't be, right?
Seen.
Because we know that it already powers all of those apps. So like it should work, but it's still pretty surprising to see something open source 2 days ago with, and again, I need to stress this, like this is the whole ecosystem that's open source. It's not,
all
it's
in
not
the same day.
just one thing. It's the whole system of things.
Yeah.
So like on each of those, we could do on like 2-hour deep dive if we know how it works, and like we prepare 1 hour deep dive for each. We didn't even try Lynx for web.
That's another thing here that's very interesting. I've never worked on a product where this was a particular area of my focus, but well, it's not true. We used React Native Web at PlayStation, but actually just so we could render the apps headlessly in Chrome to do integration testing off console as a cheaper feedback loop. And but we weren't shipping product using it, but it was always hard to scale React Native Web and its approach because it's doing a bunch of Babel transform tricks and whatever. And as soon as one team has a problem, you need a principal level engineer to go debug what the problem was. So it wasn't scaling super great. Pre-pack was had the same sort of challenges when we were trying to operationalize that as well. And so the fact that this takes out some layers of tooling and makes it a little more straightforward gives me more hope that this can be operationalized to dozens and hundreds of developers within a company in a much more cheap, just sustainably cheaper way, I would say, where you won't need a principal engineer for every 10 engineers just to help them debug their transpiler. That was kind of the economics of pre-pack and of React Native Web in my total personal experience. I'm not generalizing here. So if they seem to be coming at this from a different perspective that looks like it might sustainably economically scale better in terms of deploying it to teams of teams across geographies. That's pretty exciting. And another thing that investors or people in this area should be that should be the interesting thing, is that if it's changing the economics of this, similar to the way we talked about using module federation remotes to deliver kind of personalized experiences, is an economics change about how much it costs per user to continue to run your service in your app. That's where investors should probably be extremely interested, because
and this is such a big piece of this puzzle, and I think like this should be the next thing that they will reveal, like so we have this system, it works now. I'm saying, like, from the perspective of me as a community member, we have a system that works. I know that it can deliver me an app.
Yep.
What is your roadmap? What are your plans for this?
Yeah.
Like, how do you see that growing in 1 year, in 10 years? Like, in which direction you want to take this? And do you want the buyout from community? If you want the buyout from community, you need to tell us, like, how are you going to drive this forward? In which direction?
Yeah, I have like a very biased data point that I would love to get, which is, 2 years ago, I approached, Chmal to say, like, hey, would you like to work together to bring Vision OS to React Native? Right.
Yeah.
And you all said yes. I would be fascinated to know what that conversation is like with ByteDance to bring Lynx to Vision OS, for instance. Because the very first time, obviously, adding Windows to React Native was not smooth or easy, as Mike Grabowski will tell you. It wasn't because people made it hard on purpose. It was like, it was a new thing, right? And so for me, it's not what's ByteDance's roadmap for Lynx. It's how bi-directional can the collaboration be with them and a broader community to shape that roadmap, not just for their internal needs, but for the external community needs. And we just have no data on that yet. And
and like, so what I'm saying is, this is one of the questions for the roadmap. Do you want this to be like a really hardcore community project, or you just open source it? You want us to play around with it, maybe contribute something, but then you will keep it closed for the decision making.
Yeah. How bi-directional is that relationship?
Yeah.
If people show up and everybody is values aligned. And I'd say that was something about the early days of React that were really awesome, where there was so much values alignment that making it successful for the product, making it successful for the kind of developer mindshare capture for Facebook at the time, there's just like a bunch of alignment. And I would love for there to be that kind of alignment here with ByteDance as a corporate sponsor. And I think that, I assume there's somebody out there that's capitalized just to dive in and make like a reference app, third party. But barring that, and this was the problem with React Native in the early days, is, well, who's going to pay the engineers to build the third party reference app to show that you can replicate the success of this, that were not former Facebook or Instagram employees? And it took a little while to get that spark kind of going. And I think that if what we've seen this week with their open source release is any indication, I think ByteDance will probably be ahead of the game versus Flutter and React Native in terms of making sure that there are amazing sort of third-party contribution success and app shipping success earlier.
So listen, Matt, just like one question, because I would really want to pick your brain on this. So what would be the use case for, you were talking about like big corporations and like big decision making, and I'm not interested in that. Like in order to make that happen, like all of those things that you mentioned needs to come first. Like no one will invest millions and millions of dollars into like app in Lynx today. But like, what would be the use case for smaller products to, okay, maybe our next app will be in Lynx. It's not a high stakes. Let's try it out. Like, what would be the decision making there?
Well, you know, I would say depending on what country that you live in, you can, you know, quit your day job and be on unemployment for some number of months and build your first app then. And instead of like, let's go grovel on a live Twitch stream to get $25,000 or whatever, I think that those individual developers that see this and see the capability and go, oh, I have an idea and I want to try it. And some people can do moonlighting, you know, if they're if their employment agreement sort of allows for that. But at that kind of smaller scale with lower stakes, you can just try to make something and ship it and see what happens. And I don't think that being a first mover is a grand slam advantage every single time necessarily, but it does have advantages where even if your app doesn't work out, but you get known as the largest third-party contributor to an open source project, where people want to use it, they contact you on LinkedIn and not somebody else.
Well, this is also like good. Sorry, I want to like gather my minds. It's if you think this will work out and like you have ByteDance, you have like great engineers, you have already products that are shipped in this. If you think this will work out, like you should bet on this and like be one of the first contributors, get to know the ecosystem when it's young and when you can like form it. So like in the next 3 years, when it really booms out, like you will be one of the biggest contributors to this. And like you said, like you can replicate basically call stack, infinite red, software mansion, betting on Lynx like today. You just start like porting all of those libraries that are necessary for the ecosystem, just port them from React Native to Lynx and like you're golden.
I agree. I think that's an opportunity for people that we have seen come to fruition in React Native and in Flutter for that matter. And even in PhoneGap and Ruby Motion. Like, you know, there are people that were like known as like Ruby Motion design build houses where they built a very nice business. Most of them transitioned, pivoted into React Native later. But no, I think that there is an opportunity there for individuals or smaller groups of people at sort of smaller scales, regardless, where even if your app business doesn't take off, you've built so much credibility by building in public, trying to forge that bi-directional sort of path, that I think that CallStack, Infinite Red, this .labs, we're all there at kind of the beginning of React Native and some of these other ecosystems. And as a result, there's kind of I think, a halo effect around those consultancies. And I don't mean to leave anybody in particular out. These are just the consultancies I've personally hired repeatedly. So I think there is that facet of the ecosystem and the economics around it for third parties beyond the apps, is having consultancies that can go, you know, look at a customer's product design and go, you know what, it's a little bit more of a risk, but we think based on your designs, Lynx might be a better choice. And like in the early days of React Native, you say, we will do this project at a discount if we use Lynx, because we want to try it out. And if you can find a customer and a partner that is willing to kind of hold hands and make the leap with you and try it out, and it's safe for everybody feels comfortable doing that, then that's how you build a great business in any new ecosystem, is just finding those values aligned customers that, even with the transparency about the risks, they say, yeah, let's do it, because we don't know what will happen. It could be disruptively high multiplier, better efficient for the end user, for our designers, for our whatever, or they just want, or they have a product where technical marketing to a technical audience is a goal that they have. So they want to be viewed as innovative and using new technologies, right?
Yeah.
They're definitely
that's such a good point. Yeah.
Target that market.
That's very good point. That if you have customers that are aiming towards more technical audience, they will be. This is free marketing. Our website is built in this like technology that was like released a month ago or something.
Free is not the word I would use, but it's profitable potentially in multiple dimensions. So if one of those dimensions turns out not to be profitable, you still have this other dimension of it.
Yeah.
And technical marketing and putting a kind of a technical proficiency halo around your brand, even if you're not a consultancy, you could just mark it down as a marketing cost. Or it's like, well, we could have sponsored the Wi-Fi at Web Summit Vancouver, but instead we're going to spend that however many thousands of dollars on having a full-time engineer make a reference app, submit PRs to everywhere that needs PRs submitted to, and just to see what that's like. And there's an R&D benefit to it, to getting the inventory of the technology. There's the uplift for that engineer who's visibly doing that, like Oscar did for all the Vision OS stuff throughout the ecosystem. There's like all these dimensions that could pay off. And if you have multiple dimensions that could pay off, you increase the chances that one of them will sort of pay off. But sometimes it happens where you roll 7 dice and they all come up 1, and you're like, fuck.
Yeah.
There's nothing more that I could do. But if you have the ability to, the capital is always what I always think of. If you have the capital to spend a month trying it out, submitting PRs, trying to be bi-directional, and just setting that tone early in the ecosystem, you can
even if it fails, for a single developer working on that, like this still is beneficial working on this technology, because like the overlap with all of the different technologies is huge here. So you're learning either way.
It's low cost, high reward. If you don't have like a baby at home, different people have different living situations with different needs, right? But if you have that breathing room, we've seen over and over again, whether it was the early days of Go or the early days of .NET for that matter, like you can rise to be a prominent voice out there just by being early and being consistent and leading with positivity. And I don't see why Lynx would be any different.
Let's end on that. If someone scrolls to the last minute of this live stream, like this is the great way to end this.
We got there eventually. Awesome.
Thanks
so
much
much for the opportunity, man. I appreciate you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Like you taught me a lot on this and on other things. Thank you.
See ya.
See you, everyone.